I want to take a few moments and in 30 and 31 talk about one of the major features of the book. It's probably the single thing you will most remember about this book when it's done. I personally think the game-changing passage is an important one that we looked at already. But even though I think 29 is the game changer, 31 is something that comes into New Testament theology in a strong way. What is the new covenant? God is going to make an access agreement with Israel, and it's a very unique one. It can't be very unique. It's unique, okay? Here's the important thing. Chapter 31 has right next to that Isaiah 59. Those are the two places the term New Covenant comes from. And then I'm going back to 30 to walk you into it, okay? Now, a covenant is an agreement offered by somebody to give privileges to somebody else. In a land covenant, like an access agreement, maybe it comes with conditions, maybe not. If I give you a conditional covenant, it means you can only access my property between 6 and 9 o'clock or whatever. If I give you an unlimited access to the property, as long as you follow my path that I've given you, that access agreement becomes my covenant with you. The new covenant is an access agreement for a permanent relationship with God based on the specifics he outlines in the covenant. And it's different than the old covenant in the respect that the new covenant has features that once you're in, you become permanently part of. In the old covenant, there were many other stipulations that are different than the new covenant. Now, I'm talking around it. Let me get to it. This is going to be a renewed opportunity for the Jewish people to get to know God in a new and different way, in a more intimate way. And the problem is, when we talk about the new covenant, we got all kinds of churches named the New Covenant Church. They forgot that this was a Jewish thing. In fact, what happens is, when Jesus said, "This is the new covenant in my blood," they didn't recognize that he was in a room full of Jewish men. They thought, well, they're all Christians. They're not Christians. They were Jews at the time. And in fact, they're followers of Jesus Christ, and that distinction becomes incredibly important. But at the moment in which he gives it, he's talking about something that's going to happen to Israel. How do I know that? Well, because in the beginning of the book of Acts, the last question the disciples ask is it now that you're going to restore Israel? Acts chapter 1 is after the Gospels, after the resurrection. So clearly the disciples thought when he was talking about the new covenant and he was talking about he was talking about Jewish things, the restoration of Israel. Now, the issue for us is you get to chapter 30, and this is a rather discouraging time in the Bible, Jeremiah, but chapter 30 is an encouragement in the midst of a discouraging time. And the idea here, he says in verse 3 of chapter 30, "Behold, the days are coming," and you always see that as one of those signs by Jeremiah. He's talking about later days or prophetic days. "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will restore the fortunes of my people, Israel and Judah." Stop right there. He's in the 600s or the late 500s, and they're writing the words Israel and Judah, but Israel's been gone since 722-21. They are long gone, long forgotten in terms of their exact point of where they are. And he says, I'm going to erect again, recover again, not just the southern kingdom, but the northern kingdom as well. That's going to be a major feature. You're going to see in Ezekiel 34 and 37, you're going to see, particularly in chapter 37, where both the household of Israel and the household of Judah together will be recovered. Now here's what he says. He says that in verse 3 that Israel and Judah would be recovered, and in verse 9, if you kept reading down at verse 9, that they would again get their king, and that the king was guaranteed. It says, they shall serve the Lord their God and David their king. I'd underline that. So they'll get not only a return to the land, they'll get a king in the land, they'll get the opportunity to serve the Lord, meaning they'll have God's heart in the land. And then in verse 11, it reminds you that they were in foreign lands awaiting a return. It says, I am with you, declares the Lord, to save you, for I will destroy completely all the nations where I have scattered you. Only I will not destroy you completely, but I will chasten you justly and will by no means leave you unpunished. You're not going to get off the hook, but I'm going to bring you back, and I'm not going to destroy you or end you. I'm going to destroy a lot of nations, but not you. I'm going to bring you back. You're going to have your king. You're going to have a heart for me. You're going to have the land again. You're going to have Israel and Judah. Your long-lost cousins and brothers are going to be brought in from all over. And then he says, all the way down in verse 22, you will be my people and I will be your God. So you're going to have, in addition to those things, you're going to have a right heart before me. Now, remember, at the time this is being written, these people are heading for captivity, in captivity. This is, I know, you've been through the breaking of your temple, the breaking of your kingdom, but I have a future for you. Now, that's the encouragement. By chapter 31, the prophet shares God's heart for Israel. He reminds them that God has loved them with an everlasting love. Listen to the beginning in verse 3. The Lord appeared to him from afar, saying, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore, I have drawn you with loving kindness. Who is he talking to? Humanity? The church? Who's he talking to? Look at verse 1 and tell me who the people are. Israel. So he says, I have a future for Israel. You will again be my people. I've loved you with an everlasting love. I know there's some great songs that people use and co-opt these things to the church, but they were written originally. Now, does that mean God doesn't love you with an everlasting love? No, of course he does. But don't steal their verses unless you want to steal their problems, okay? Is what I'm saying. Watch very closely in 31, because in the beginning, he says, don't be concerned with being cast aside. Again, verse 4, I will build you and you will be rebuilt. That's going to happen. Now, I know that all of you accept that, and I don't see anybody giving me a hard time about that. But in the midst of the encouragements, God specified exactly what he had in mind for the reconstruction of the land of their fathers. He promised to sow the land with their children and their grandchildren and restore the places. Look down at verses 17 to 28 in chapter 31. 17 to 28. You go down to 17, and it says, there is hope for your future. I don't think he could be more clear. There is hope for your future. Your children will return to their own territory. Write the word land, okay? They're coming back to the land. I have surely heard Ephraim. That would be, of course, talking about the northern kingdom, grieving. You have chastised me, and I was chastised like an untrained calf. Bring me back that I may be restored. For you are the Lord my God. So I've heard even from your cousins that have been gone for 200 years off in captivity, or 120 years off in captivity. I have heard from them, and I'm going to bring them back. Verse 19, after I turned back, I repented, and after I was instructed, I smote on my thigh. I was ashamed, humiliated, because I bore the reproach of my youth. Is Ephraim my dear son? Is he a delightful child? Indeed, as often as I have spoken against him, I certainly still remember him. Therefore my heart yearns for him. I will surely have mercy on him, declares the Lord. The northern kingdom may have been taken away. The Assyrians may have taken them away in 722, but I'm going to bring them back. Yes, I chastened them. Yes, they were chastised, but I always loved them and I never lost track of them. The 10 lost tribes are not lost to God. He knows exactly where they are. He's going to bring them back. And then it says in verse 21, set up for yourself road marks, place for yourself guideposts, direct your mind to be the highway. Direct your mind to the highway, the way by which you went. Return, O Virgin of Israel, return to these your cities. And he's obviously talking about the land. The new covenant has to do with an access agreement that has to do with Israel and with Judah and a return and the land and an inheritance, becoming permanently the people of God. You will be my people. That's what the new covenant context is. And what's interesting is he comes down to it, and look at verse 27, because this is where we pick it up line by line. Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord. What does that normally denote in Jeremiah? End times. when I will sow the house of Israel and the house of Judah with the seed of man and with the seed of beast. What does that mean? I will make you prolific. You will be like rabbits. There will be lots more of you. As I have watched over them to pluck up, break down, overthrow, destroy, and bring disaster, so I will watch over them to build and to plant. I took you apart, I knocked you down, now I will build you up, and I will restore you. In those days, they will not say again, the fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. But everyone will die for his own iniquity. Each man who eats the sour grapes, his teeth will be set on edge. That doesn't sound positive, but it is. Here's what he's saying. There's coming a day when I will stop spanking you for what your fathers did wrong. When, if I take it out on you, it's because you did it. You ate it, you tasted it. It's not going to be about other people in the past. There's coming a day when I will individually judge what has heretofore been collective. You've been collectively punished for your fathers. The day is coming when I won't do that anymore. Individuals will receive me. Individuals will come to me, and I will forgive them as individuals for their own sin. Verse 31. Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant, underline new covenant, and then circle with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Every Bible study you will be in for the rest of your adult life, people will say the new covenant is for the church. This is the third time I've read Israel and Judah in just a few verses. He couldn't be more clear. The new covenant he's talking about isn't to the church primarily. It will affect the church. It will come up in new church speech. But it is the ending, landing agreement to bring Israel back and be their people once and for all. Today we would call that the millennial kingdom. The new covenant is the permanence of all of them coming. They look on him whom they have pierced. They bow their knee. They accept him. Romans 11, all Israel will be saved, and they will go into a kingdom where he will sit on a throne. The new covenant is, why do you need a 1,000-year period? Why this millennium? Because God's not done checking off all the boxes of what he promised to do with, through, and to Israel. And so that 1,000 years is essential to get it done. Here's the bottom line. It's not like the covenant which I made with their fathers in the day that I took them into the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. The new covenant will be permanent, but not have domicile conditions. It won't be, you're not going to get cast out of the land anymore. This is a permanent land access covenant. Once you get in it, you're in it. You're going to be in it forever. But this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days. Again, highlight that it's with Israel. So that when you're in the Bible study and they say it's about the church, you can say, then why does he keep saying Israel? Why does he keep saying Judah? Why does he keep saying restore them to the land? Why does he say he's going to call them back to the land? Because new covenant, the way it's talked about in Christianity is, I'll just put new hearts in people. That's great, but that's not what it says in the Bible. Here's what he says. I will put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. This is a promise he's picked up earlier in the book. This is not the first time you've read it in Jeremiah, and it's always been related to the Jewish people. There's never been a time in Jeremiah where he said, by the way, I'm going to make Ethiopia my people. Now, that mystery will be uncovered, that Gentiles will come to faith, but not here. That's not what he's saying here. Here's what he says. This is the covenant which I will make the house of Israel after those days. They will not teach again each man his neighbor and each man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they will all know me. Right next to that, Romans 11:26. They will all Israel will be saved. Romans 11:26, right next to verse 34. They will all be saved. And it says, from the least to the greatest of them, declares the Lord, for I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more. That is eternal salvation. In the Bible, when God says, I will remember your sin no more, you're eternally taken care of, justified, declared righteous. Thus says the Lord, who gives the sun for light by day? Who fixes the order of the moon and the stars for light by night? Who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar? The Lord of hosts is his name, the Lord of the armies, Tzvaot. If this fixed order departs from before me, declares the Lord, then the offspring of Israel will also cease. If I lose control of the sun, moon, and stars, then I will lose control of my promise to Israel. You're supposed to read it the other way. I won't ever lose control of the sun, moon, and stars, so I'll never go bad on this offer. Thus says the Lord, verse 37, if the heavens can be measured and the foundations of the earth searched out below, then I will cast off all the offspring of Israel for all that they have done, declares the Lord. It's supposed to be an absurdity. You're not going to measure heaven. It's not going to happen. I'm reliable on this promise. I will save my people. Verse 38, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when the city will be rebuilt for the Lord, from the tower of Hananel to the corner gate. The measuring line will go out farther straight ahead to the hill of Harib. Then it will go on to Goach. And the whole valley of the dead bodies and of the ashes and all the fields, as far as the brook Kidron and the corner of the horse gate toward the east, will be holy to the Lord. It will not be plucked up or overthrown anymore forever. So the ending promise is they'll be in Jerusalem, the walls will be there, and it will never be overthrown again, ever. From the time of the salvation of the Jewish people with the coming of the Son of Man in the clouds, when they look on him whom they have pierced, until eternity, there will be peace among that people. There will be a disruption in some part of the earth, but not with them. They will be his people. Now, here's my point. My point is that what went wrong with the way the New Covenant's been taught? If you were to mark next to chapter 31, Isaiah 59, verses 18 to 21, someone turn there and read 59, 18 to 21.
According to their deeds, so he will repay wrath to his adversaries, recompense to his enemies, to the coastlands he will make recompense. So they will fear the name of the Lord from the west, and his glory from the rising of the sun. For he will come like a rushing stream, which the wind of the Lord drives. As a redeemer will come to Zion, and those who turn from transgression in Jacob, declares the Lord. As for me, this is my covenant with them, says the Lord. My spirit which is upon you, and my words which I have put in your mouth, shall not depart from your mouth, nor from your mouth of your offspring, nor from the mouth of your offspring's offspring, says the Lord, from now and forever.
So he says in Isaiah 59 that I'm going to declare across the nations, draw people back. I'm going to re-establish the people there, and that will be a permanent establishment. This isn't the return after Babylon, because they don't have the heart of God. This isn't the return after Babylon because Israel didn't return yet. To this day, the northern tribes never came back. So this is still understood literally to be a future prophecy if you're a literalist, and I am. So here's the bottom line. For one thing, people forget that it was a covenant with Israel. And so they name their churches after it because they think it's just, I'm just going to put a new heart within you. And if you watch the way the songs refer to these passages, they drop all mention of Israel or Judah all the way through. Second, no covenant in Scripture ever bulldozed a covenant before it. Paul's going to make this argument. When God gave a later covenant, he didn't bulldoze the earlier one. When God says to Abraham, this is a covenant, it's built on top of the covenant to Noah. In other words, when God said, let me make a covenant with Abraham, you don't have to start worrying when it starts raining because the Noah covenant was bulldozed away because now there's the Abrahamic. Every covenant builds on the covenant before us. And Psalm 89, verses 19 to 29 say that the covenant with Israel will last forever. Romans 11, verses 11 to 32 say that the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable to Israel. That's why both the Hebrew Scriptures and the Christian Scriptures have said it very clearly. God isn't done with Israel. He's not. As long as I'm God, as long as I run heaven, he says, I'm going to keep a special relationship with his people. And it seems that some people just change Israel to church and they keep right on reading. And that's fine, it's just wrong. If that were true, God could simply cross out one group and go with another. And a lot of churches honestly believe that in a supersessionism and a replacement. The idea that, well, Israel got so bad that God traded them for the church. Here's the problem. If you looked at the church. So the Apostle Paul was a Jew, and he grew up following Judaism. And here's the thing. And when he got to Romans 11:1, he said, I'm an Israelite. God has not cast away his people. And the rest of the chapter is clear that God has a future to fulfill to the sons of Abraham through Isaac, through Jacob. And it's not an allegory. Some people are saying, well, it's all allegorical of a future time. When God says, I have an everlasting love for Israel, but he really doesn't mean Jews, he means somebody else who isn't Jewish, then that's not really fair. The whole thing breaks down because now nothing is as it says. If he keeps saying household of Israel, household of Judah, household of Israel, household of Judah, how can it not be the household of Israel, household of Judah? But I have been on buses in Israel with people that would fight vehemently that that's not what it means. It means the church. And I would look at him and say, why is he wasting words? Household of Israel, household of Judah, household of Israel. And why is it encouraging to people going into exile that I'm going to bring back people? They're not exactly you. They're somebody who has somebody's heart sort of like you, and you should be encouraged that I'm going to do what? My kids are going to die in exile, and you're going to bring somebody back to the land? Oh, but the land just meant church. I'm going to bring them back to, like, the church. Well, they didn't fall away from the church. They walked in the first time. What are you talking about? And so it becomes sketchier and sketchier and sketchier. The disciples understood it this way. Peter preached it this way. At the first revival campaign in Acts chapter 3, verses 10 to 26 at Pentecost, people were told by Peter that the death of Jesus was to renew the covenants of God with Israel. That's what he said. And I got to tell you, it wasn't a church meeting. It was at the Jewish temple at the time. So, am I saying that the new covenant would not include non-Jews? No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying Jeremiah didn't know that. I'm saying that there is something about the new covenant that God introduced another piece to, that the New Testament revealed that the Old Testament never saw. And this is it. In 2 Corinthians, Paul says, 2 Corinthians 2, verse 4 says, actually, if you look all the way through chapter 2, 2 Corinthians 2, he's very careful to say he's a minister of the new covenant. And he's writing to Corinth, and they're Gentiles. And he says that the new covenant symbol is the change of heart, the transformation of heart. That's the symbol of it in principle, but not in letter, he said. The letter of the new covenant is when God changes Israel. The principle is seen in Jesse. God changes the heart of a Gentile on his way to making Jews jealous in Romans 10 and 11, on his way to drawing them back to the land, on his way in Ezekiel 37, on his way to bringing about a tremendous upheaval in the nations and judgment, on his way to breaking through the clouds and replacing their heart. In other words, instead of God's going to save Israel and then Gentiles, it's God's going to save Gentile, 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 Israel. They're the point of the prophecy. You're a beneficiary of it. You get the new covenant in transformation, but not in covenant itself. The new covenant isn't written to the church. You're not in the new covenant in that way, but the principle of life change is there. So the point of the original agreement was with Jewish people to draw them to a renewed relationship with God. And as a non-Jew, I have a temporary benefit to be allowed to join the benefits of the agreement for a time. I'm able to step into the life transformation part of it. And that's going to be the forerunning shuddering that an earthquake is coming. And when that earthquake comes, they will look on him whom they have pierced, and they will all know me. If we remove the Jewish people from the promise and substitute them for the church, as many people do, then God never completed his promises to the Jewish people. Israel never got regathered. The northern kingdom was lost and never came back. They never got the land promises. And when you read Jeremiah 31 or Isaiah 59, they sound like land promises. Just remember this. If God's commitment to Israel isn't forever in Psalm 89, then that same word forever is what your salvation is held by. If forever doesn't work for them, don't you bet on it's going to work for you either. Unless God means what he says. Unless he will have an everlasting love for the Jewish people, even when the veil has been placed over their heart that we talked about in Joel 2. And during this time, Paul says it this way in Romans 11. They're enemies for the sake of the gospel, but because of their fathers, there's a renewal coming. The gifts and calling of God are irrevocable in Romans 10 and 11. So 2 Corinthians 2 says this, such confidence we have through Christ toward God, not that we are adequate in ourselves to consider anything as coming from ourselves, but our adequacy is from God, who also made us adequate as servants of the new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. He says, I'm working in a new covenant ministry with Gentiles in Corinth in spirit, not letter. Why? Because the letter isn't written to them, but the principle is. Bottom line is, verse 6 is the key. If you get to 2 Corinthians 3:6, turn there and mark closely that you're servants of the new covenant, not of the letter of the new covenant. What is the letter of the new covenant? Not the specification of who it's to, but the spirit of it is at work now. That's what he's trying to tell you. Does that make sense? So, you can come to Jesus Christ and be transformed in your heart because you're a forerunner of what God is about to do to a nation. All right, here's my point. My point is that the new covenant then is the permanent access of God, permanent access agreement by God to draw the Jewish people back to the land, and then in a subsequent time. When we read in Ezekiel 34 to 37, you're going to find out God's going to draw the people there and sometime later change their heart. So I believe that they're already being drawn back, that persecution is on the rise, anti-Semitism is alive and well in Europe right now, and it ain't doing that much worse. It's actually coming on strong in many other countries. Let me say it that way. So let me just say this. As anti-Semitism rises, Jews flee to go back to Israel. And if anybody asks me, why do you believe in a literal approach to the prophecy, it's going to come down to one word, Israel. Because if it weren't for the literality of what I see, the actual historicity of what I see there, I'm not sure you could know that these weren't supposed to be poetic. They're not supposed to be poetic. God has regathered. You have to understand the Jewish people were without their language from the year 70 until the 1800s. Nobody was speaking Hebrew on the street at all. It was revived in the 19th century and is now the national language again. What you are seeing is a revival of a people that were gone into the nations. They never would have come back. Questions about the new covenant. This is not going to go away. Your whole adult life, you will be listening to people say things about the new covenant that aren't the new covenant. Okay? You all right? Okay, I have only one more passage I want you to see, and then I'm going to cut you loose. Okay? I want you to jump now for a minute over to Jeremiah 36, and I want you to see that the passage in 36, and I'm looking specifically for 36 to about 39, and I want you to just see the setting of this. Now, on your diagram back here, you can see that you're still in the period at the end of the captivity statements, coming up to the beginning of the remnant in the land. Here's what I want you to see. Look at the story in 36:1. In the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, this word came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, take a scroll, write on it all the words which I have spoken to you concerning Israel and concerning Judah and concerning all the nations, from the day I first spoke to you, from the days of Josiah, even to this day. So God instructed him, write the book of Jeremiah. That's what he said. I want you to write down all the stuff I gave you. contemporary in his life. This wasn't written by somebody after. It was written by him. And then it says, verse 3, perhaps the house of Judah will hear all the calamity which I plan to bring on them, in order that every man will turn from his evil way. Then I will forgive their iniquity and their sin. It's interesting that during the period of the Babylonians, this is when writing becomes much more a daily thing. It's much more widely disseminated. We start to find libraries during the end of the Babylonian, the rise of the Persian period. We start to find scrolls that have been sealed with various clay seals. And those clays in rooms where the scrolls caught on fire, those clay seals were actually hardened. And so we find them. When you find a library, often what it is just the clay seals. You don't have the scrolls anymore. By the way, more Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the last 2 weeks. Haven't had any of those around since the 60s. And they got into a room and found that there's another labyrinth of caves. So the 930 scrolls that we have of the Dead Sea Scrolls set probably will rise. The first one they found was an intact jar with a scroll in it. They whisked it away. Turns out the scroll was blank, that somebody had put the scroll, the vellum material, in there to preserve it. Now we're going to have some real interesting discussions as to what does that mean. There were ideas about the Dead Sea Scrolls being attached to one set of caves and one site, but now they're finding them in other places. There was already 10,000 volunteers that scoured the cliffs, but now you've got to have something that's going to be real interesting as we are challenged with some new material. So far what they found was the wrappings for scrolls, that is cloth that comes from the same time period, about 150 BC. So we don't have a lot new scroll material yet, but there's going to be a good number. I just read it this morning. So let's take a look at this. It says that Jeremiah called Baruch, the son of Neriah, and they wrote on a scroll the dictation of Jeremiah, all the words that the Lord had spoken to him. Jeremiah commanded Baruch, saying, I am restricted. I cannot go into the house of the Lord. So Jeremiah was under some kind of house arrest, couldn't go to the temple. Baruch had to come to him. He's dictating these things. Now, what happened to that scroll? I told you this story. Go down to verse 20. It says, so they went to the king in the court, but they deposited the scroll in the chamber of Elishama the scribe, and they reported all the words of the king. The king sent Yehudi to get the scroll, and he took it out of the chamber of Elishama the scribe, and Yehudi read it to the king as well as to all the officials who stood beside the king. Now the king was sitting in the winter house in the 9th month with a fire burning and the brazier before him. When Yehudi had read 3 or 4 columns, the king cut it with a scribe's knife and threw it into the fire that was in the brazier until the scroll was consumed in the fire that was in the brazier. Yet the king and all his servants who heard all these words were not afraid, nor did they rend their garments. Even though Elnathan and Delaiah and Gamaliel pleaded with the king not to burn the scroll, he would not listen to them. And the king commanded Jeremiel, the king's son, Sariah the son of Azrael, and Shelemiah the son of Abdil, to seize Baruch the scribe and Jeremiah the prophet. But the Lord hid them. So you see that the first draft of the writing of all of these things was burned. So then, verse 27, put a box around it. Then the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah after the king had burned the scroll and the words which Baruch had written, all the dictation of Jeremiah. And he told him what to do with it. And look down at verse 32. Jeremiah took another scroll, gave it to Baruch, the son of Neriah, and the scribe, and he wrote on it all the dictation of Jeremiah, the words of the book which Jehoiakim, king of Judah, had burned in the fire. And then look at the end. And many similar words were added to them. In other words, we have 2 ancient editions of Jeremiah. They're 2 different lengths. Jeremiah ends up in Egypt. He gives us 1 length. The other one is longer. But in the scripture, it explains why there are 2. And so you'll go into a classroom and they'll look at you and say, there are 2 Jeremiahs. The word of God conflicts and there's... No, it tells you there's going to be 2 of these. They're both going to be called the words of Jeremiah because, frankly, nobody wants the words of Baruch, the hired hand. Okay? So these are going to be collections of what Jeremiah wrote. I think because the original design of the book was so badly torn up that you have this kind of scroll that's kind of makeshifted together. And when you look through Jeremiah, one of the reasons it's so hard to study this book is not just the contents, but the way the material is organized. The end of this is in verses 11 to 21 of chapter 37. You have an imprisonment, verse 11. It happened when the army of the Chaldeans had lifted the siege from Jerusalem because of Pharaoh's army that Jeremiah went from Jerusalem to go to the land of Benjamin in order to take possession of some property there. And it's while he's there in the middle of 13, they arrested Jeremiah the prophet and said, "You are going over to the Chaldeans." Jeremiah said, "A lie, I'm not going to the Chaldeans." Yet they would not listen to him. And so eventually Jeremiah was brought before officials. And it's interesting because he's accused of changing sides. He's not changing sides. And by chapter 38, he's put down into a cistern, one of the things that he had to endure. And you see in chapter 38 that he's down in this cistern, and it says, verse 6, "Then they took Jeremiah, cast him into a cistern of Malchiah the king's son, which was in the court of the guardhouse, and they let Jeremiah down with ropes. Now in the cistern there was no water, but only mud, and Jeremiah sank into the mud." I leave you with this phrase from Jeremiah because Jeremiah really is the prophet with that sinking feeling. That really, it's not your imagination. It really is. And that really summarizes what went on with the book. Because by the time you get to chapter 39, verse 6, it says the king of Babylon slew the sons of Zedekiah, blew before his eyes, and blinded Zedekiah's eyes. Chaldeans also burned with fire the king's palace. And in the latter part of chapter 39, he is spared, but the place comes apart. It's that sinking feeling.